The Indwelling Christ by Alexander Maclaren. That Christ may dwell in your hearts by faith, ye being rooted and grounded in love. Ephesians 3, verse 17. We have here the second step of the great staircase by which Paul's fervent desires for his Ephesian friends climb towards that wonderful summit of his prayers, which is ever approached, never reached, that ye might be filled with all the fullness of God. Two remarks of an expository character will prepare the way for the lessons of these verses. The first is as to the relation of this clause to the preceding. It might appear at first sight to be simply parallel with the former, expressing substantially the same ideas under a somewhat different aspect. The operation of the strength-giving Spirit in the inner man might very naturally be supposed to be equivalent to the dwelling of Christ in our hearts by faith. So many commentators do, in fact, take it. But I think that the two ideas may be distinguished, and that we are to see in the words of our text, as I have said, the second step in this prayer, which is in some sense a result of the strengthening with might by the Spirit in the inner man. I need not enter in detail into the reasons for taking this view of the connection of the clause, which is obviously in accordance with the climbing up structure of the whole verse. It is enough to point it out as the basis of my further remarks. And now the second observation with which I will trouble you, before I come to deal with the thoughts of the verse, is as to the connection of the last words of it. You may observe that in reading the words of my text, I omitted the that which stands in the center of the verse. I did so because the words, ye being rooted and grounded in love, in the original, do stand before the that and are distinctly separated by it from the subsequent clause. They ought not, therefore, to be shifted forward into it, as our translators and the Revised Version have, I think, unfortunately done, unless there were some absolute necessity, either from meaning or from construction. I do not think that this is the case, but on the contrary, if they are carried forward into the next clause, which describes the result of Christ dwelling in our hearts by faith, they break the logical flow of the sentence by mixing together result and occasion. And so I attach them to the first part of this verse and take them to express at once the consequence of Christ's dwelling in the heart by faith, and the preparation or occasion for our being able to comprehend and know the love of Christ which passeth knowledge. Now that is all with which I need trouble you in the way of explanation of the meaning of the words. Let us come now to deal with their substance. 1. Consider the indwelling of Christ as desired by the apostle for all Christians. To begin with, let me say in the plainest, simplest, strongest way that I can, that the dwelling of Christ in the believing heart is to be regarded as being a plain, literal fact. To a man who does not believe in the divinity of Jesus Christ, of course that is nonsense. But to those of us who do see in him the manifested, incarnate God, there ought to be no difficulty in accepting this as the simple, literal force of the words before us. That in every soul where faith, howsoever feeble, has been exercised, there Jesus Christ does verily abide. It is not to be weakened down into any notion of participation in his likeness, sympathy with his character, submission to his influence, following his example, listening to his instruction, or the like. A dead Plato may so influence his followers, But that is not how a living Christ influences his disciples. What is meant is no mere influence derived but separable from him, however blessed and gracious that influence might be. But it is the presence of his own self, exercising influences which are inseparable from his presence and only to be realized when he dwells in us. I think that Christian people, as a rule, do far too little turn their attention to this aspect of the gospel teaching and concentrate their thoughts far too much upon that which is unspeakably precious in itself, but does not exhaust all that Christ is to us. That is, the work that he wrought for us upon Calvary. Or to take a step further, the work that is now carrying on for us as our intercessor and advocate in the heavens. You who listen to me Sunday after Sunday will not suspect me of seeking to minimize either of these two aspects of our Lord's mission and operation. But I do believe that very largely the glad thought of an indwelling Christ who actually abides and works in our hearts and is not only for us in the heavens or with us by some kind of impalpable and metaphorical presence, but in simple, that is to say, in spiritual reality, is in our spirits, has faded away from the consciousness of the Christian church. And so we are called mystics when we preach Christ in the heart. Ah, brother, unless your Christianity be in the good, deep sense of the word mystical, it is mechanical, which is worse. I preach and rejoice that I have to preach a Christ that died, yea, rather that is risen again, who is even at the right hand of God, who also maketh intercession for us. Nor do I stop there, but I preach a Christ that is in us, dwelling in our hearts, if we be his at all. Well then, further observe that the special emphasis of the prayer here is that this indwelling may be an unbroken and permanent one. Any of you who can consult the original for yourselves will see that the apostle here uses a compound word which conveys the idea of intensity and continuity. What he desires then is not merely that these Ephesian Christians may have occasional visits of the indwelling Lord, or that at some lofty moments of spiritual enthusiasm they may be conscious that he is with them, but that always, in an unbroken line of deep, calm receptiveness, they may possess and know that they possess an indwelling Savior. And this, I think, is one of the reasons why we may and must distinguish between the apparently very similar petition in the previous verse, about which we were speaking last Sunday, and the petition which is now occupying us. For, as I shall have to show you, it is only as strengthened with his might by his Spirit in the inner man that we are capable of the continuous abiding of that Lord within us. Oh, what a contrast to that idea of a perpetual, unbroken inhabitation of Jesus in our spirits, and to our consciousness is presented by our ordinary life. Why shouldst thou be as a wayfaring man that turneth aside to tarry for a night? May well be the utterance of the average Christian. We might, with unbroken blessedness, possess him in our hearts, and instead, we have only visits short and far between. Alas, alas, how often do we drive away that indwelling Christ because our hearts are foul with sin, so that he can but listen at the gate and hear the household jar within. Christian men and women, here is the ideal of our lives, capable of being approximated to, if not absolutely in its entirety reached, with far more perfection than it ever has been before by us. There might be a line of light, never interrupted, running all through our religious experience. Instead of that, there's a light point here and a great gap of darkness there, like the straggling lamps by the wayside in the half-lighted, squalid suburbs of some great city. Is that your Christian life, broken by many interruptions, and having often sounding through it the solemn words of the retreating divinity, which the all-profound legend tells us were heard the night before the temple on Zion was burnt? Let us depart. I will arise and return unto my place till they acknowledge their offenses. God means and wishes that Christ may continuously dwell in our hearts. Does he, to your own consciousness, dwell in yours? And then the last thought connected with this first part of my subject is that the heart strengthened by the Spirit is fitted to be the temple of the indwelling Christ. How shall we prepare the chamber for such a guest? How shall some poor occupant of some wretched hut by the wayside fit it up for the abode of a prince? The answer lies in these words that precede my text. You cannot strengthen the rafters and lift the roof and adorn the halls and furnish the floor in a manner befitting the coming of the King. But you can turn to that divine Spirit who will expand and embellish and invigorate your whole spirit and make it capable of receiving the indwelling Christ. That these two things which are here considered as cause and effect may, in another aspect, be considered as but varying phases of the same truth is only part of the depth and felicity of the teaching that is here. For if you come to look more deeply into it, the Spirit that strengtheneth with might is the Spirit of Christ, and he dwells in men's hearts by his own Spirit, so that the apparent confusion arising from what in other places are regarded as identical, being here conceived as cause and effect, is no confusion at all, but is explained and vindicated by the deep truth that nothing but the indwelling of the Christ can fit for the indwelling of the Christ. The lesser gift of his presence prepares for the greater measure of it, the transitory inhabitation for the more permanent. Where he comes in smaller measure, he opens the door and makes the heart capable of his own more entire indwelling. Unto him that hath shall be given. It is Christ in the heart that makes the heart fit for Christ to dwell in the heart. You cannot do it by your own power. Turn to him and let him make you temples meet for himself. 2. So now in the second place, notice the open door through which the Christ comes in to dwell, that he may dwell in your hearts by faith. More accurately, we may render through faith, and might even venture to suppose that the thought of faith as an open door through which Christ passes into the heart floated half distinctly before the apostle's mind. Be that as it may, at all events, faith is here presented as the means or condition through which this dwelling takes effect. You have but to believe in him, and he comes, drawn from heaven, floating down on a sunbeam, as it were, and enters into the heart and abides there. Trust, which is faith, is self-distrust. I dwell in the high and holy place, with him also that is of a contrite and humble spirit. Rivers do not run on the mountain tops, but down in the valleys. So the heart that is lifted up and self-complacent has no dew of his blessing resting upon it, but has the curse of Gilboa adhering to its barrenness. But the lowlands, the humble, and the lowly hearts are they in which the waters that go softly scoop their course, diffuse their blessings. Faith is self-distrust. Self-distrust brings the Christ. Faith is desire. Never, never in the history of the world has it been or can it be that a longing towards him shall be a longing thrown back unsatisfied upon itself. You have but to trust and you possess. We open the door for the entrance of Christ by this simple act of faith, and blessed be his name. He can squeeze himself through a very little chink, and he does not require that the gates should be flung wide open in order that, with some of his blessings, he may come in. Mystical Christianity of the false sort has much to say about the indwelling of God in the soul, but it spoils all its teaching by insisting upon it that the condition on which God dwells in the soul is the soul's purifying itself to receive him. But you cannot cleanse your hearts so as to bring Christ into them. You must let him come and cleanse them by the process of his coming, and fit them thereby for his own indwelling. And assuredly, he will so come, purging us from our evil and abiding in our hearts. But do not forget that the faith which brings Christ into the Spirit must be a faith which works by love if it is to keep Christ in the Spirit. You cannot bring that Lord into your hearts by anything that you do. The man that cleanses his own soul by his own strength and so expects to draw God into it has made the mistake which Christ pointed out when he told us that when the unclean spirit is gone out of a man, he leaves his house empty, though it be swept and garnished. Moral reformation may turn out the devils. It will never bring in God. And in the emptiness of the swept and garnished heart, there is an invitation to the seven to come back again and fill it. And while that is true, remember on the other hand, that a Christian man can drive away his master by evil works. The sweet songbirds and the honey-making bees are said always to desert a neighborhood before a pestilence breaks out in it. And if I may so say, similarly quick to feel the first breath of the pestilence is the presence of the Christ which cannot dwell with evil. You bring Christ into your heart by faith, without any work at all. You keep him there by a faith which produces holiness. 3. And the last point is the gifts of this indwelling Christ. Ye being, or as the words might more accurately be translated, ye having been rooted and grounded in love. Where he comes not empty-handed. He brings his own love, and that, consciously received, produces a corresponding and answering love in our hearts to him. So there's no need to ask the question here whether love means Christ's love to me or my love to Christ. From the nature of the case, both are included. The recognition of his and the response by mine are the result of his entering into the heart. This love, The recognition of his and the response by mine is represented in a lovely double metaphor in these words, as being at once the soil in which our lives are rooted and grow, and the foundation on which our lives are built and are steadfast. I have not time to dwell upon these two things, but let me just touch them for a moment. Where Christ abides in a man's heart, love will be the very soil in which his life will be rooted and grow. That love will be the motive of all service. It will underlie, as a productive cause, all fruitfulness. All goodness and all beauty will be its fruit. The whole life will be as a tree planted in this rich soil. And so the life will grow not by effort only, but as by an inherent power drawing its nourishment from the soil. This is blessedness. It is heaven upon earth, that love should be the soil in which our obedience is rooted, and from which we draw all the nutriment that turns to flowers and fruit. Where Christ dwells in the heart, love will be the foundation upon which our lives are builded steadfast and sure. The blessed consciousness of his love and the joyful answer of my heart to it may become the basis upon which my whole being shall repose, the underlying thought that gives security, serenity, steadfastness to my else fluctuating life. I may so plant myself upon him, as that in him I shall be strong, and then my life will not only grow like a tree, and have its leaf green and broad, and its fruit the natural outcome of its vitality, but it will rise like some stately building, course by course, pillar by pillar, until at last the shining topstone is set there. He that buildeth on that foundation shall never be confounded. For remember that deepest of all, the words of my text may mean that the incarnate personal love becomes the very soil in which my life is set and blossoms, on which my life is founded. Thou, my life, O let me be, rooted, grafted, built in thee. Christ is love, and love is Christ. He that is rooted and grounded in love has the roots of his being and the foundation of his life fixed and fastened in that Lord. So, dear brethren, go to Christ like those two on the road to Emmaus. And as Fra Angelico has painted them on his convent wall, put out your hands and lay them on his, and say, abide with us, abide with us. And the answer will come, this is my rest forever. Here, mystery of love, will I dwell, for I have desired it, even the narrow room of your poor heart.